Yeah. All I need is one mic. Yeah. All I need is one mic.
Hey everybody, welcome back to One Mic, where I watch shit so you don't have to. And today I'm here to talk about season 1, episode 2 of Disney and Marvel's What If, entitled What If T'Challa Became a Star-Lord. The concept behind this episode is that essentially, instead of having Peter Quill as Star-Lord, we have T'Challa as Star-Lord. And I'm going to start by saying this episode, if you watched my review of the first episode, this episode does everything that I said this show should be doing and none of what the first episode did that I didn't like. So in short, this episode is 10 times better than the first one, and it operates in a world that is what I came to this show expecting to get, and not just a rehash of one of the movies with a different starring character. Everybody who is featured in this is voiced by the same actor who we recognize from the MCU, except Drax. Drax appears at one point, not voiced by Dave Bautista, but everyone else we see is voiced by the actor from the films, which is pretty cool. The concept behind this is that rather than scooping up Peter Quill, rather than scooping up Peter Quill, he scoops up T'Challa instead by mistake. Long story short, because this is that episode where there's so many differences and there's so many Easter eggs and there's so many things to talk about that if I talked about all of them, this would be way longer than it needs to be. So I'm going to kind of look at it from an overall sense and just kind of drop in little specifics here and there. But picking up T'Challa caused an entirely different world essentially to be created, not just a branching of a timeline, because in this world, T'Challa is seemingly caused everything to be good. Characters that we recognize as villains from the films are now essentially good guys for the most part. There's an entire running joke throughout the episode about Thanos and his obsession with genocide. And Thanos was essentially talked out of this plan by T'Challa, and now he's actually joined the Ravagers and is part of their team. And again, still voiced by Josh Brolin. It's really weird, but it's cool and it's fun. But he picks up T'Challa instead. He raises T'Challa, and T'Challa becomes Star-Lord, but with a more positive twist, right? You know, Quill's always been kind of a dick, kind of a goof off, very selfish, looking out for, stealing for himself. Whereas T'Challa is like a Robin Hood character in this. And they even, in my notes, I'm writing down oh, okay, so T'Challa's kind of like a Robin Hood because he's stealing from the powerful and giving back to the poor. So he's not stealing for himself. And it opens the same way that Guardians 1 opens, but with that difference of it being T'Challa instead of Quill, and then everything that takes place afterward is different. So with him being good, this Robin Hood character, they even mention this directly. Yondu at some point calls him Robin Leach by mistake, which is a reference that is such a deep cut. I feel that most people who watch the show are not going to get it, and I'm not going to explain it because I'm an asshole. So I'm not, but he mistakenly calls him Robin Leach, but he's this Robin Hood character, and he's doing all this good stuff. And even the opening sequence is different in that I forget his character's name, but the character that Djimon Hounsou played in Guardians 1 and Guardians 2. But you remember Guardians 1 opens up with essentially Quill stealing the Power Stone and Djimon Hounsou's character coming, showing up, and there's a whole fight and all this kind of stuff. Instead, T'Challa is so respected in the galaxy for all the good that he's done that Djimon Hounsou's character worships him, and they have a really funny quote unquote fight sequence that is pretty entertaining to see. And eventually he joins the team. So you have a T'Challa kind of leading a team of guys who are essentially considered bad guys in the MCU, but are all basically good here. We see Nebula with hair and looking very less robotic, still voiced by Karen Gillan. We see who else do we see? Like I mentioned, we see Thanos, still voiced by Josh Brolin. Let's see, Yondu is still voiced by Michael Rooker. We see Sean Gunn's character, whose name escapes me at this moment, still voiced by Sean Gunn. And in Thanos's turn toward benevolence, I guess you could call it, the Collector has stepped in to fill that power void. And the Collector is still very much the same Collector, although he's a lot more built than Benicio del Toro was in the films. He's still voiced by Benicio del Toro, by the way. And essentially, the idea now is that the Nebula has a plan where, there's this thing called, what was it, the embers of something or other, some sort of embers or whatever, that could terraform entire ecosystems, and like little bits of it can make a whole planet, can feed a whole planet essentially, or make a whole planet lush with food that can be, consumed. And like this vial of it can transform galaxies. So it's essentially, again, the plan is to do massive good, right? And they essentially, the episode becomes like a heist episode where the plan is to steal these embers to do good from the Collector, who's a bad guy, and just help a bunch of people. And it features a double cross, a triple cross, and like all kinds of cool shit. And this is a story. This is the important part. This is a story that is completely devoid of anything related to the MCU or Guardians. And this is what I was saying this show needed to do. Last week, we had the Captain America episode, Captain Britain, what was her actual name? It's not Captain Britain. Captain, I've already forgotten. I've already dismissed this episode from my mind. But the Peggy Carter episode was essentially the first Avenger movie with Peggy Carter instead of Steve Rogers, with a couple of minor twists. This episode goes a completely different direction. We get the premise again at the beginning, essentially, of it being T'Challa instead of Quill. But then like I said last week, it creates an entirely new story, an entirely new universe where all of our characters that we know, aside from the Collector, are different. And that's what I wanted, is a self-contained story that's interesting. And they even tell it interesting. Like it has a very Ocean's 11 kind of vibe where it's like you cross-cut between someone explaining the plan and us seeing the plan being executed. It's a interesting thing because you don't see anything like that in the MCU. But it tells a completely different story with all of our characters different, and that's what I wanted from What If. One change, one impetus that sparks something entirely different, and then we get essentially a new universe with a cool little self-contained story for that 30 minutes or so. It's not a huge ask, but episode 1 was not interested in doing that, and this episode did. And for that reason, this episode is exponentially better than the first episode, and hopefully this is how it will continue. Couple of thoughts that I had here. I'm gonna look over my notes. I mentioned that all characters were the same except Drax. I mentioned the Robin Leach reference. We see we have an actual interaction with Howard the Duck, as opposed to like the couple of times that we've seen him in the background. Howard the Duck actually starts to take T'Challa on like a tour of nowhere as in the location of nowhere that you guys will recognize from Infinity War. And he's voiced by Seth Green, which is actually pretty cool. At the end, we see Ego visit Quill as an adult, and he's like mopping up a Dairy Queen. I'm wondering if that's going to be another episode of the show, because you could do something like that where you have Quill kind of essentially assisting Ego with his plan from Guardians 2. And again, I don't want to see Guardians 2 again, don't get me wrong, but I'm just saying it's a direction you could go where Quill essentially works with Ego knowingly and willingly, not like, by being tricked by Ego, but like with Ego being straight up with him, and they work together. You could have an episode like that. Thanos was shockingly chill in this episode, which again was very weird with him still being voiced by Josh Brolin. Like I said, he was convinced, like I said, not beaten, convinced that his genocide snap plan was a bad idea. And they have like an ongoing gag where like he discuss, like people keep fucking with him about it. Like, oh, that kind of sounds like genocide. Like, no, not really, because it's random. Like he's like jokes a lot, which is kind of cool. And then there's a cool fight scene between him and a couple members of the Black Order, which I thought was also cool. The Black Order, still villains. They're protecting the Collector now. Proxima Midnight, still voiced by Carrie Coon, which was nice. There's a couple of twisted turns there that I won't put out there. The Collector's acquire some really cool shit. I'm not gonna put that out there either, but he uses a couple of things, but then like there's like a moment where like I guess like a cabinet sort of thing opens and it like drops down and you can see all the stuff that he has in there. And there's a lot of like nice little like, ooh, look at that. Oh, how'd he get that? Some pretty interesting stuff that tells you that if he has these items, he really is putting his foot down in this universe. So that was pretty cool. And I think that's really all I had to talk about with this episode, to be honest. You know, like this episode took the show in the right direction. Like I said, it changed one thing and then created an entirely branched off, entirely different universe. And it told a pretty cool new self-contained story within that universe with these different characters. And that's cool. Like I like seeing good guy Thanos and good guy Nebula with hair and Yondu was pretty much the same. But you know, T'Challa as it wasn't like we had T'Challa be Star-Lord in place of Quill. It was like it was a completely different Star-Lord with completely different goals and completely different ideals. And I found that to be interesting and an interesting change. So this episode did virtually everything right. It looked cool, had some cool fight scenes, characters fighting that we wouldn't have seen before. You know, all kinds of cool shit. So this is a really fun episode. I really enjoyed this one. 10 times better than the first one. So if you found the first one to be off-putting, this should be your jam. So I read that T'Challa, I'm going to say Chadwick appears in 4 episodes in this season. So this is just one. And yes, Chadwick it's nice to hear him again. You know, you can't help but think about, you know, how things would have gone were Chadwick still alive. But, you know, having this moment where, you know, you get to see him still be T'Challa, still be good in a completely different landscape with completely different characters that we never got to saw him interact with in the films. It was still kind of cool. Like, oh, here's T'Challa and Thanos like being buddy. Like, you know, this is kind of cool. So, and then he still has all the like Quill's, like, you know, his fucking helmet thing and his little blasters on his feet and shit like that. He still has the cool Star-Lord shit. Yondu still has his little whistling thing going on. That, you know, there's a lot of stuff that we've come to like throughout the MCU that we see in this episode, and a lot of cool stuff that we've never seen before, we'll probably never see again, that we wouldn't know would be on some sort of bucket list of ours, but we get to see some pretty cool stuff. So good episode, and I will see you guys next week for episode 3. Peace.